please welcome Joe and Vitalik on stage.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you guys doing?
Excellent.
I'm excellent too. What a coincidence.
Well, this is going to be fun. So I have a handful of questions around a lot of these things are kind of covering the history of how you two met and the Ethereum project in general. But, and we'll get to some controversial stuff closer to the end. But just to kind of start off this chat, how did each of you initially meet each other? And what was sort of the history around you joining the Ethereum Foundation and just the project?
Yeah, so I grew up in a mythical northern territory called Canada, as did Vitalik. And I regularly went back home over essentially the Christmas, December vacations to go visit my family. And I had been living in Jamaica at the time. I'd been paying a huge amount of attention to Bitcoin for a bunch of years already. I'd been reading articles from this very clear expositor of the technology in something called Bitcoin Magazine. And I later on came to understand that this was actually a remarkably young person who I was learning a lot from. And there was this Bitcoin Foundation thing that looked sort of shady, and then up north there was this other Bitcoin group. I forget what was Anthony's
Bitcoin Alliance of Canada.
Bitcoin Alliance of Canada. And so there was this guy up in Canada, a guy named Anthony Diorio, who was taking a more bottom-up grassroots approach. And so I hadn't really, I made myself expert in the technology by reading all the time, and I hadn't really been part of the community at all. And so when I went up to visit my family, I called this guy Anthony, and we chatted for a while, and he said, oh, by the way, there's this guy Vitalik, and I knew who Vitalik was, and he wrote a white paper that people are excited about, and we're going to have a meetup. I think it was January 1st, 2014. Why don't you come by, and you can check it out. And so talked to Vitalik for a few minutes about it. Vitalik said he'd send me the white paper. I read the white paper that night, and then it was quite a big, energized meetup. It was at this place called Decentral in downtown Toronto that Anthony ran. And for the next few days and weeks, there was a ton of activity on Skype, and people were just coalescing into essentially a project. And Anthony rented a place in Miami in advance of the North American Bitcoin conference, at which Vitalik was set to deliver a paper describing the Ethereum platform. Remember any of that?
Yeah, no, the meetup was great.
Yeah, and so throughout, between that meeting and the North American Bitcoin conference, there was just an insane amount of mostly Skype and meetup activity. And so,
Just between you two or the whole team?
Globally. Yeah.
That's awesome. So if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the first time you're together in London since Devcon 1, which was in 2015. What are sort of some of your highlights from that event? What do you kind of remember? A lot of surprises there. Would love to kind of get your take on how Devcon 1 was 4.5 years ago.
And it was a bigger event than the Ethereum community had ever had before then. There were somewhere over 300 people at this big hall in central London at the conference, and it came together for a week.
Gloriously ordained hall, so more ornate than this even. It was pretty special.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were a lot of excitement all around. This was also when some of the Microsoft stuff was being announced for the first time, and since then, Microsoft has obviously done quite a lot of things for the Ethereum ecosystem. Yeah, just it definitely felt like a big coming out party.
Yeah. So my recall was that we felt that we were this tiny niche community. Talking still on Skype a lot, some meetups. and just doing something that felt like it had real magnitude, that drew in a lot of people. So that event was arranged and then canceled and then revived, and so it ended up being, I think, an inflection point in our ecosystem, because we all arrived and there were so many of us, and we were so excited, that there were so many people that were so excited about being there, and it really just injected so much energy and momentum into our ecosystem. The other really remarkable thing, which I think we all started realizing in a bit of a buzz on Thursday, was that in the main room or in the back area, we were all talking, and then everyone realized relatively simultaneously that 4 days into it, nobody had talked about the price of Ether. And so it was just so obvious that it was a group of builders, developers, et cetera. And so
that's exactly why these events are great, because people specifically care more about building, and it's always excited to see that. No, that's amazing. So Vitalik, you're with the Ethereum Foundation. Joe, you lead ConsenSys. I wanted to ask this to each of you. Vitalik, what do you think ConsenSys does better than the Ethereum Foundation? And sort of similarly, Joe, what do you think Foundation does better than what ConsenSys does?
I think enterprise outreach is a big one, and ConsenSys has brought in, they've brought in Microsoft and brought in quite a lot of other companies to the Ethereum ecosystem, and they're definitely starting to contribute more and more, and that's something that I definitely think the Ethereum Foundation does not do nearly as well.
So early on, ConsenSys was pretty much focused on continuing the vision and the mission of the Ethereum project. And we had license to do whatever the F we wanted to do. So the foundation is a special animal. It needs to be a neutral steward of the ecosystem. It's sort of a shelling point for certain things in our ecosystem. ConsenSys could run crazy experiments and do splashy marketing events, et cetera. And it didn't, we worry a little bit about statements that we're making or how we're perceived, but we did have the luxury of essentially exploring a lot of different pathways and making lots of noise, and we do need a very strong foundation, in my opinion. I like the minimalist approach, but I also think that we need a clear voice that is the center or shepherd, steward of our ecosystem, and we play pretty complementary roles, I think.
So maybe just to dig in a little bit deeper on that, what would you say the role of the foundation is right now, and kind of how do you think about what the priorities are for what you need to do as the project?
I think in general, and support things that are valuable and really important to the ecosystem that don't have a way of funding and supporting themselves. So historically, that's involved a lot of research, a lot of things like client development and outreach, communications, and then over time, like the way that the foundation has done some of those things has naturally changed. So like, for example, over the last kind of 2.5 years, the foundation's use of grants has really ballooned a huge amount. But I feel like in general, those goals are still the same.
That makes a lot of sense. So we're in London today. This event, there's about 300 people here. A lot of them are hacking on new projects, anywhere from E2.0 to DeFi. And what I want to kind of do is just get your take on what do you think about the UK Ethereum and the Web3 community? Are there any projects you're excited about? What are your general comments on how this specific country and this region is evolving with respect to anything from regulation to developer interest? Just what are your general comments and thoughts around the space?
UK has always been a big center of the Ethereum community. And even at the beginning, we had a fairly sizable communications team here. And then, of course, a big part of Solak was built out of here. And that was a big part of the ecosystem early on. And right now, Aztec has been doing a huge amount of great work. There's a lot of other companies. I mean, there's like Clearmatics doing things on the enterprise side, for example. There's quite a lot of just different smaller projects.
Yeah, so ConsenSys has quite a big Shoreditch office. Obviously, there's incredibly strong academia in the area, lots of cryptographers. We have a handful of projects that span enterprise and mainnet focus. So there's Apex 3, data analytics, soon trading platform. There's Adhara, there's Trustology, there's DrumG. They're a little more enterprisey. Aztec protocol, spectacular, enterprisey and mainnet-y at the same time for sure. And I do think it goes back to what Vitalik said. There's a madman, jewel-smoking Stefan Twall who did a spectacular job of essentially driving so many people, especially he maintained just a massive meetup list and ran lots of events. And so I think he created a really strong foundation for the Ethereum community way back then.
No, the Ethereum London meetup group is still one of the biggest meetup groups in the world. No, that's definitely true. Kind of being on that theme, I feel like the word enterprise is being thrown as a negative thing, or just like not as excited. But like I don't think that's the case. But I actually want to understand. So how do you see the enterprise world on blockchains and Ethereum specifically kind of evolve over time? And both of you have kind of made comments around mainnet and enterprise kind of merging eventually and over time. Kind of how do you see that going forward, or kind of what do you imagine that looks like?
Yeah, and I guess among some people, kind of the word enterprise has definitely had kind of a bit of a historical connotation of traderness, because it's like, oh, it's the centralized people, they're coming in, ooh, they're gonna use private blockchains, and in reality, I think enterprises have, in many cases, played a quite helpful and complementary role to the Ethereum ecosystem. Even like Ernst & Young kind of built kind of Nightfall, and it's been open sourced, and even like Clearmatics, for example. And sometimes those projects are kind of on private and consortium chains, though even when they are, the beauty of the Ethereum ecosystem is that a lot of the work can be kind of transferred over to the public ecosystem pretty easily. And also increasingly, there's been more and more kind of enterprise activity on the mainnet starting to happen, and just as people are realizing that public blockchains are a trustworthy thing that is here to stay.
So I think just like young humans essentially need to explore their own path, they need to differentiate themselves. As they mature, they first individuate from where they came from, and then they sort of incorporate the new good stuff that they've discovered with the old good stuff that millennia of society has discovered. I think ecosystems are very similar to that. So if you take a look at the internet ecosystem, it was a bunch of radicals as well who built out different protocols and essentially wanted to change the way the world operated. And many in enterprise liked what they built, and many in enterprise started using SMTP and HTTP and HTML, et cetera, in more constrained environments, in intranets. That all effectively merged into enterprises, or new kinds of enterprises, or brand new companies built by those young people that have effectively become the establishment. And so I think we're going to see a similar pattern here. I think I don't know, is Coinbase enterprise at this point? In a sense, they sort of are. And so we see the technology becoming mainstream at some point soon. We see private permissioned networks continuing to exist. I like the idea of use case sufficient decentralization where it is sufficient. And I also expect that lots of permission systems, and there already are permission systems, they will all probably move to mainnet or layer 2 that connects to mainnet. And so basically see the...
How do you define moving to public blockchain? Is that just relying on them as a central source?
So if you build a logical construct for your system, it can sit on a disconnected private permission version of the Ethereum technology, or it could be lifted to a different version if privacy, confidentiality, scalability, usability are all addressed well, and they're all being addressed extremely well. Then there's no reason why you couldn't lift a system and lay it back down on mainnet. We anticipate that lots of private networks will link laterally to one another. So the Comgo Commodity Trade Finance Network is doing that with VACT, which is Commodity Trading Network. We already see linkages down to mainnet from these private systems just to pin the state for anti-collusion purposes. We see most enterprises or many enterprises that we talk to, some of the biggest in the world, getting very serious about tokens, issuing tokens, bonds, a wide variety of uses, and anything of real value needs to be on a maximally decentralized platform. You can move it to another platform for different reasons, but if you try to put something that ends up with real value on a much less decentralized platform, it's going to be attacked. That's just not going to be a viable solution going forward for the financial world. We have one project which we're actually going to announce March 4th with two of the biggest companies in the world, focused on building a system that takes private information and processes from either private chains or even just private data stores or documents, and entangling those pieces of information among different counterparties in interesting ways using zero-knowledge techniques, and enabling that information to be tracked on mainnet. So I think it's going to be driven from within the enterprise Ethereum mainnet working group, and I believe it's going to be a pretty significant breakthrough in how enterprises use mainnet.
Next week, that's exciting.
It's like a few days.
That's awesome. My question would have been, when do you see that happening? And you already answered that. So
a few days.
Very soon. Vitalik.
So we're coming out with a POC. It's a supply chain POC that will introduce a new protocol.
Awesome. Vitalik.
That's my name.
Mr. Buterin.
That's also my name.
Dr. Buterin?
Oh, God.
What is E2.0? And could you give us an update on what's going on with the development of 2.0?
Sure. So ETH 2.0 is a set of very significant upgrades to the Ethereum blockchain that's been researched for the last few years and will be kind of is being implemented and will be switched over the course of the next couple of years. And
could you highlight what the
yeah, so
are?
the two biggest parts of it are proof of stake and sharding. So proof of stake naturally being this new consensus algorithm that replaces proof of work mining, and sharding being this scalability technique that allows many more transactions to go on chain because not every node in the network has to verify all of the transactions. And the current status is that, so it's the upgrade is broken up into multiple phases, where phase 0 creates a proof of stake chain, phase 1 adds basic sharding, and then there's this likely proposal that a kind of merger of the two systems will happen after this, and then there will be some further upgrades that add more kind of computation capacity to the sharded chains. And phase 0 is getting quite close to launch, so it's extremely close to having multi-client testnets. It's already had single-client testnets for quite some time. It's already kind of run through a couple of rounds of kind of security auditing and client optimization, and it'll have a few more rounds. So I'm generally quite optimistic about that becoming a real thing very soon. And and from there, the network will become more and more sharded, and we'll have lots and lots of scalability.
Can you quantify some of these improvements in terms of what does scalability mean here relative to what we have?
Sure. So I think in general, we're estimating somewhere between a factor of 100 and a factor of a few hundred for sharding by itself.
Transactions per second?
Yes,
Okay.
and a factor of, so going up from the current numbers, which are like 10 to 40, depending on what kind of transaction it is. But then, of course, this could end up being multiplied further if people use roll-ups on top of sharding.
Well, we'll get to that soon. That's awesome.
Yes.
Can I jump in there? So one thing I'm excited about is that unlike, say, the x86 upgrade life cycle, this was a brand new design space, so it's a new network. It will be a fundamentally much better set of solutions, unconstrained by what happened before. Yet, right from the start, both networks are essentially going to be linked. And so there's going to be a pretty smooth merging, evolving from Ethereum 1.
That was actually my next question.
Yeah, from Ethereum
is that a
1
choice
to Ethereum
or
2.
an expectation?
So with respect to the tokens moving across, with respect to staking on one chain or moving tokens to another chain, with respect to making use of data from one chain into another chain, with respect to building backward-looking bridges, with respect to finalizing blocks on the first chain. So there's going to be this synergy between the two, which will make it feel like it's one system, yet it'll be a slow migration to essentially a much better system over time.
No, it's awesome. And that's over the next couple of years, or rather after phase 1?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. We kind of talked about things that both of you kind of generally share the same opinions on. I want to kind of say or ask, what is something that you, Joe, disagree with Vitalik on, and Vitalik, what you disagree with Joe on?
Yeah, so we were discussing this a little bit before, and we were having a tough time coming up with something. I generally agree with Vitalik because he's very smart, and we are philosophically generally quite aligned. One piece that I came up with was around on-chain governance, where I remember multiple meetings in the first year where we talked optimistically about how we could get rid of the foundation and replace it with a set of smart contracts, and we just needed to get to the point where we had sufficient functionality so that we could do on-chain voting around protocols, et cetera. I describe myself as, on that issue, somewhere between Vlad and Gavin Wood.
Oh, I live between the North Pole and the South Pole, too. What a coincidence.
Exactly. And Vitalik is also between those two. I think we're all much closer to Vlad, or the two of us are much closer to Vlad. So I think I've heard Vitalik say that he doesn't think there should be on-chain governance, and I feel that we should strive to moving some governance on-chain, some voting systems, et cetera. And so I don't know if that's still true if we can prudently build enough infrastructure over time so that we can start making decisions in that sort of context.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
That's no fun. We're not very good at coming up with
I'm still waiting
things
for
that
him to answer that.
Yeah, no, and I just really can't think of anything else on this one, unfortunately.
It's all good. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in this space, from kind of what we initially saw the DApp ecosystem would do to where DeFi is now. Out of curiosity, kind of having been part of ConsenSys and kind of seeing that evolve over the last few years, what would you say, Joe, just kind of some lessons learned from how DeFi is evolving, and kind of where do you think people should focus on in this space as projects that are working on DeFi, to like some lessons anywhere from regulation to the development side of it that they might not know as new entrants into this space?
So the ICO phenomenon was awesome, yet problematic in certain ways. One way we tried to address some of the difficulties was by starting up a project called TrueSet, which was designed to source, and Masari's sort of similar, designed to source information from the ecosystem so that we would have the critical pieces of information about different protocols, new ICOs, who the actual human beings are, what the total number of issued tokens are, et cetera. And so so that's one thing we're trying to do with a project called DeFi Score, where we essentially rate different money Lego parameters, essentially. And so DeFi is just so spectacular. I feel like so Ethereum and maybe some other massively decentralized protocols are a new trust foundation for the planet. On that new trust foundation, we need to build a financial plumbing layer, and that's what DeFi, open decentralized finance, is doing. And so we have all these protocols for so many things, from prediction markets to insurance to decentralized exchange to derivatives to synthetics to licensing to payments to automated portfolio management. It's just astonishing. And all of that, once we work it out and get it really functional, is going to be a massive magnet that draws in the rest of the world, either new business models or legacy businesses, and essentially becomes the decentralized global economy. And so that layer needs to innovate somewhat, hopefully permissionlessly, and I hope we can do a lot of that around the world, but it also needs to pay attention to what regulators are thinking and doing, because they're all watching now quite intensely. And so lots of those projects are VC funded, and so they're going to have to figure out how to balance innovation and being in a regulated environment, and that's something that ConsenSys is pretty good at. And so we're taking perhaps we have a lot of lawyers that spend a lot of time in Washington, so we run all of our ideas, for better or worse, through that group.
Awesome. DeFi is definitely one of the kind of the topics in talks at the town right now. What are some other things that you're kind of excited about or hopeful for in the next year or so with respect to Ethereum ecosystem growing?
One of them is just kind of increased privacy. So we've been seeing like Tornado Cash as one example, and I think we're going to see better ones soon. And this is something that the Ethereum ecosystem is starting to really recognize the need of, and especially since we have a lot of things like ENS popping up, and we have more and more kind of richer types of transactions happening. And I think there's definitely kind of a growing realization of the need to not have all of your activity be publicly linkable to all of your other activity, So that's one thing. And another thing is also security. And there's different kinds of security. Like, for example, we started caring about smart contract security quite a bit more after the DAO. And I mean, so far it seems to have paid off. And we've seen much fewer kind of unfortunate splats recently than we have before, recent flash loan stuff notwithstanding. But then there's also like user account security, for example, and I've been a kind of consistent evangelist for things like smart contract wallets, multi-sig, social recovery, and all of these things. And you know, we've seen Argent, we've seen tools like the gas station network to help facilitate these things, and a lot of other interest in smart contract wallets. So that's been good, and I kind of hope to see more of that. Also, exchanges, another big example. So the kind of non-custodial exchanges happening more and more. So I mean, Uniswap is obviously kind of the first one, and that was completely decentralized. But now more recently, I mean, Buterin just launched a few days ago, and they're based on ZK rollup. So you actually have this property where, and even if the server misbehaves or the server disappears, they can't do anything bad, and users can still take all of their money out, which is amazing, and that's something that I hope that all exchanges will adopt in the medium term. And I think if they do, then we'll see a lot fewer kind of large splats of people losing funds of a different kind. And yeah, just in user experience and all of those things, and improving at the same time. I think we'll just see kind of ongoing great improvements to just the ecosystem and people's ability to use Ethereum.
It's a lot to be excited about. So I'm going to go with two. One is, and I should probably stop calling them enterprise. Let's call them maybe non-blockchain native companies. I expect to see many large ones and medium-sized ones getting really excited about doing something significant, some piece of their business on public mainnet. The other piece is a little more esoteric. So we have a very large number of people at ConsenSys who are working on different Ethereum 2 projects. The Quilt team is working on phase 2, and we even have a designer who has some specialty in developer experience. And so being able to make some statements about what developer experience will be like on Ethereum 2 and what some of the early execution environments might be like. I look forward to seeing some interesting releases on that in maybe Q3, Q4 of this year.
That is a lot of stuff to be excited about. And I guess the best part of this is that because so much of this is composable, you do get a lot of compounded pace in terms of development, and you can still hope for a lot of things happening in just a few months. The next section I want to actually cover is a section where we call underrated, overrated. And the way it's going to work is I'll throw out a topic. Each of you have to comment on, is this underrated or overrated, and then 1 to 2 lines on why. And you can kind of feel free to answer however you please, and then we'll kick this off actually with public goods funding.
I think we've been talking about it a lot, but probably still underrated on net. I don't know, public goods are important, man.
So underrated, I think we have mechanisms that can massively magnify that, as we've seen on Gitcoin, and also mechanisms that can identify externalities and bring them under the tent, essentially, to be calculated.
That's great. I like the brief responses. ZK rollups.
I think underrated. I think rollups in general are cool, and we've seen in the last month kind of a lot of well-deserved hype from on optimistic rollups with teams like Arbitrum and Optimism doing a lot of great work. So the thing about ZK rollups in particular, right, is that they have some advantages, like you don't have to rely on fraud proofs, and instead you just rely on these kind of ZK snarks to just prove validity of things immediately. And over the last few weeks in particular, there's been some kind of quiet but very significant improvements in just zero-knowledge proofs and of ability to quickly verify more general kinds of computation. So the general problem with CK rollups is that historically, like even for specific applications, I remember Lubin gave the numbers that their cost of a transaction was 0.3 cents for on-chain data and 0.3 cents for the proving time. And recently, they've just optimized that proving time by more than an order of magnitude. And for general purpose computation, which is kind of much more expensive now, and as I mentioned, there's these kind of quiet improvements along the pipeline happening that seem like they'll bring us considerably closer to having a kind of general purpose virtual machine that you can do zero-knowledge proofs over. So I'm quite excited overall.
Yeah, so underrated will eventually be more elegant, more universal, more immediate, more comprehensive. Will take longer to get all that done.
ProcPal.
So I have a better suggestion for how we do Ethereum governance. How about Joe and I have a fist fight on stage, and if Joe wins, ProcPal gets implemented.
I'm worried about coronavirus.
Yeah.
Can we kick each other?
Sure. No other
Answer that question, or
We call that diplomacy. Flash loans.
so we're not answering ProcPal. I want to hear.
So I think I heard flash loans are really interesting. Like, it's interesting because you have this sort of new kind of financial primitive that just doesn't exist in any other context just because of kind of fundamentally what it is. Like it's a loan that you have to pay back within the same transaction. And yeah, and it seems to have had some really cool effects. But, we'll see how that survives kind of sharding and more reliance on asynchronous transactions there, but we'll see.
Where are you going to go with that?
I was just going to say.
Are we still on ProgPow or Prog Flash loans, or what's my question?
Flash loans.
Flash loans. Flash loans are just awesome. There will be so much complication in figuring that out. I think we're going to have to go slow and have a lot of cross-project communication, collaboration, and maybe even dumb down some of the protocols a little bit and make slow progress.
That's great. Similarly, I guess on the same theme, decentralized oracles.
I think we definitely need more work on those.
Definitely outside the kind of how we want this to work, but what's kind of missing? Like, what does it mean to get more work done? Is it just more people should be working on them, or we need structural problems to be solved?
More different kinds of oracle designs, kind of explore the design space better, try to come up with oracles that are more secure and more decentralized, and good ways of using them.
Yeah, so what I haven't seen yet is a framework for what kinds of use cases need what kinds of rigor with respect to oracles. And so whether it's with respect to value or the valence of decision-making in a political context or something like that, if we had that framework, then we could come up with classes of oracles where it's fine to have anybody send in some information, or some sort of branded entity that has stake in their organization could be useful for some things like ESPN for sports or something like that, all the way up to something that's very rigorously or massively decentralized for high value things.
Next up is EIP 1559. And I guess before you answer that, would either of you want to tell the audience about what that is?
Sure. So EAP 1559 is this proposal for reforming the way that fee markets work, where instead of having a fixed gas limit and kind of per block and maximally volatile transaction fees, you have this kind of flexible system where you have a gas limit which is twice as large or possibly 3 times as large as a kind of gas target. And so if there's short-term spikes in kind of volatility of demands, then instead of all of that turning into transaction fee volatility, some of it turns into just volatility of block space usage. And so transaction fees become more stable. It also fixes the kind of first price auction problem that we have with fee market design right now, where it's just really hard to figure out what fee a transaction should include. And then most people end up putting fees that are fairly low, and they end up waiting a few blocks. And it turns out that that waiting doesn't actually do any good to the blockchain. It just means it gets loaded a bit later instead of getting loaded a bit earlier. And so there's a lot of kind of inefficiency that's there for no reason. And EAP 1559 just kind of fixes a bunch of all of those things at once.
So underrated?
Yeah, underrated.
Yeah, so Vitalik came up with the idea. Eric Connor ran
Sense a
with
bit
it,
of bias here.
wrote it up. One of the few ideas in the Ethereum ecosystem that Vitalik came up with. And so it's a really exciting one. Early on, we took various advice from professionals about not talking about the Ether, the Ethereum token, in certain ways. And we were really interested in promoting developing, rather than focusing on the more financial aspects, say of the Bitcoin ecosystem. And it is simply a fact that a strong Ether secures our ecosystem better, draws more attention to our ecosystem, draws more talent to our ecosystem. And we've never tried to do anything artificial to prop up the price of Ether. This is a pretty exciting natural way to improve the protocol that also has probably very positive impact on the price of Ether.
And kind of just from that, the last topic for this section, Bitcoin on Ethereum, underrated or overrated?
I think underrated. I think it's definitely, it would be nice to see more versions of kind of Bitcoin on top of Ethereum happening with kind of different and better kinds of trust models. Like right now, we just have basically centralized ones. Like, can we go at least up to a federation? Can we go up to something crypto economic? I think it would be good to see more of those things.
Yeah, so Ether is currently the bandwidth for permissionless decentralized finance, and more bandwidth for permissionless finance is a great thing, so underrated.
So I just noticed that there were no overrated answers here. So since Vitalik won't comment on ProcPow, what's one thing that you think is overrated in this ecosystem right now?
Overrated, underrated questions?
That's a good one. I don't know. I mean, to be fair, I think some of the answers kind of implicitly were correctly rated.
It doesn't have to be binary, but
No, I mean, even like DeFi in general is correctly rated, I think.
I guess our entire ecosystem and everything we do is presently underrated.
I'm looking for specifically overrated.
Can anyone out there come up with something in our ecosystem that's overrated? Private blockchains.
Okay. Since I won't repeat it, it's not on the audio. That's all right. We'll get this to the audience questions.
So nobody came up with an answer.
Nobody came up with an answer. I'm not sure if that's a good
It's
thing
an
or a bad thing.
ecosystem that is still immature, still nascent, and still massively underrated.
That's actually exciting. Final question before we move on to the Q&A from the audience. What is both of your favorite memories of working with each other through the early days of Ethereum?
Do you have any? I don't really do favorite memories, but
No, just like about a lot of like time we spent together in places like Switzerland.
yeah, that was great. Just getting shit done together. That's kind of what we both do. So, two things, and just have to be careful how they're expressed because people are involved and stuff. One, for a long time, people didn't think that Vitalik had a sense of humor, and it was obvious from early on that he has a pretty impressive sense of humor. So as people started realizing that and being just shocked by it, that was kind of amusing to some of us who knew him and saw him cracking jokes all the time. And early on, just some of the politics on the project was interesting, where people were starting to manipulate each other, and Vitalik one time just said something about how, like, these different patterns of how people were trying to manipulate him. He just said it in a meeting, and it was just very funny to everybody that he was just so aware of what was going on.
I think Ethereum maximalism is slightly overrated.
That's great. Straight from the source. With that, thank you so much. We'll
Proof of work is overrated.
proof of work is overrated. Okay, there we go. This is gonna get.
We
some
found
points.
one. I love proof of work, but it is overrated by some people. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll move on to the Q&A from the audience. So what we'll do is just raise your hands if you have a question. We have some questions from Twitter and other social media networks, and we'll repeat those questions directly. But if you have a question here, raise your hands. We'll pass on the mic.
Cool, yeah. So we're trying out this new thing with Pepo, basically taking a bunch of questions from the audience. So it's the official community app of ETHLondon and ETHGlobal this year. So for the first question from Pepo is, what are your current thoughts on kind of the DAO explosion recently and the growth in that space?
And DAOs are kind of great long-term. The current iteration, and also probably slightly overrated. I guess, no, in general, kind of like all of these experiments with decentralized governance are great, and in things like Moloch DAO, for example, have done a pretty kind of great and valuable contribution to the Ethereum ecosystem. I guess my main worry about the space that I do is that people kind of get lazy and they assume that a DAO is basically just like a multi-sig with 12 people voting, and like that has its place, but it would just be nice to see more people experimenting with things that are not that.
Yeah, so people, when they get together to do something, generally need some form of governance. We're building all these network collaboration platforms that we're going to live in together, work in together, play in together, and so we're going to have to make use of these new, hopefully more transparent, hopefully more granular, hopefully more imbuing of agency to more people, both financial agency and political agency. And so, yes, it's going to take a while before we are able to translate some really good ideas into robust code. And I think it's just an incredibly powerful concept to do all this governance programmatically, and it's going to take quite a while to build layers and layers of that sort of infrastructure. There's one project that our open law project is doing called Allow, a legal DAO, and so we're gonna see real DAO structures that are actually embedded in legal infrastructure, and so that's going to give a bunch of projects comfort. And
I love how Lao is the Chinese word for old.
For gold?
Old.
Old. Oh, yeah, that's funny. What's old is new again.
Cool. So I'm going to start back here. Anybody have any questions? All right. First one.
So, what do you think the world is moving to a post-scarcity society? And if so, do you think that the education system is actually doing a job at allowing us to, like, essentially do the things we want from our lives?
So I didn't hear that very clearly.
So what are your views on that current education system? And how would you ideally want it to be so that we could be prepared for a potential post-scarcity society?
So education system and post-scarcity society? Okay.
Basically, yes.
I don't think it's a post-scarcity society. I think we're definitely moving toward a different kind of scarcity society. Zero marginal cost society is one of the kind of characterizations that I really agree with. And ultimately, there's still a lot of ideas, a lot of kind of inventions that it would be nice if we had, and unfortunately we still don't have, and that's a kind of scarcity that I think we're still going to be stuck with for quite some time. But it is the sort of thing that's already leading to and will continue to lead to significant social changes. And even, for example, thinking about public goods within the Ethereum ecosystem and of what kinds of models would be good for encouraging just more development of them. And as far as what educational things can help people to adjust to this new kind of world, it depends. I don't feel like there's kind of a single big thing. I feel like there's more of a lot of small things.
Yeah, so I think many technologies are going to move us towards something that could be described as a post-physical scarcity society or material scarcity society. We're still humans. We're still going to need attention. So that will probably be a scarce resource, potentially, unless we have some really great simulations or robots or something like that, so maybe not. And we're going to be working together, learning together on these collaboration networks. And so I think we're going to be going to festivals, and it's going to be about art and gaming, et cetera. And so this technology is going to be a way for us to keep score, keep us engaged while not needing to kill each other or do destructive things in order to be humans, basically.
Hey, Vitalik, Joe. Good to see you both. My question is about decentralized identity, which I think has, since the beginning of the project, been considered a really important network primitive, but perhaps hasn't quite materialized yet. So what do you think are the challenges to materializing real decentralized identity? And when that does come about, what innovation do you think that will unlock in the protocol?
Sure. So first of all, it depends on kind of what you mean by identity, because people mean different things by it, right? So like, for example, there's this weaker version of identity that basically says, is about people's ability to maintain some kind of persistent account that has a kind of high level of security that they can use to interact with things. And that's something that we're seeing more and more of already, both in the form of kind of fairly explicit initiatives and also just tools in the Ethereum ecosystem growing in general. Then there's also identity, kind of as in creating some way of detecting accounts that correspond to a unique person. And I've written a bunch of things about how that's a very valuable primitive for building many kinds of governance mechanisms, basically because if you have coin-driven mechanisms, which is basically the only thing you can have if you don't have a way of measuring people directly, then you can't distinguish one person with $1 million from 1,000 people with $1,000 each. And so, because the one person with $1 million is better at coordinating with themselves than 1,000 people are with each other, the one person with $1 million is always going to kind of steamroll over anyone else more than he should. Yeah, I guess statistically it's still usually a he, but we'll hope that changes. And whereas if you have governance mechanisms that do kind of count people more explicitly, you can do things like quadratic funding, you can do other kinds of voting mechanisms, and just your space of different things to choose from increases quite a bit. And I know there are a bunch of projects that are trying to do this, solve this kind of unique human problem in a reasonably decentralized way. There's things like social graph analysis. There's sort of different kinds of kind of challenge and response verification. There's ideas around how to combine this with stronger support for privacy. It generally seems to be a very interesting space.
Yeah, so very early on in ConsenSys's life, we realized that we needed an identity construct to represent people, organizations, things, content, etc., and just access to different systems as well. We started a project called Uport a long time ago. Uport has built a bunch of different iterations of what we thought was state-of-the-art at that moment. We have iterated for a bunch of years, along with many in the ecosystem, developing a deep understanding of the subtle, complex thing that you could call identity. So we were one of the founders of a group called the Decentralized Identity Foundation, which has created a specification for DIDs, decentralized IDs. Those are identities that are constructs that don't need blockchain, but they make blockchain better, and blockchain makes them better. We also drive the W3C verifiable credentials working group, and so credentials are things that cryptographic attestations that you can make between one identity and another identity, or some behavior, or various other things. So this identity credentials or claims construct is going to be the identity reputation system for the world, I think. There's so much that still needs to be built out. And so our Uport team is working with different enterprises mostly. There's Alastria, which is a Spanish nation-state blockchain infrastructure. There's LACchain, Latin American countries that are getting together to do this. There's the European Union blockchain services infrastructure. And so all of these are now making use of this construct, which I think the world, so IBM joined that organization, Microsoft and Accenture, et cetera, are all, I feel, zeroing in on this, this notion of IDs and credentials, I think so. We have a product called Certo that enables companies to set up identities for themselves and identities for people. So that's one vector where we can push identity out into the world. Just making use of or enabling people to log in to blockchain-based applications. We have internal software that we use to sort of help run and understand the shape of ConsenSys, and basically your Uport ID can give you access to that. Also, content is really interesting. So we have a project called Civil that is enabling content to have identity, and so we'll soon see some major media organizations represent their content in registries for licensing and attest to the fact that this content was real. It's not fake content.
Cool. We have time for two more quick ones.
Hi, both. I was wondering, how do you see the interface between the Ethereum ecosystem and the traditional legal systems develop in the medium-term future? And whether you can picture a healthy legal approach and regulatory policy between nation states and blockchain systems as more and more economic activity starts to migrate towards decentralized blockchains.
I think one kind of big question is kind of what part of this is a blockchain level concern and what part of this is an application level concern, because different kinds of applications pose different challenges in terms of their interactions with the legal system. Like financial applications might have one set of challenges, and then applications for like raising funds might have another set of challenges. Things that have to do with identity might have some third set of challenges. There's some privacy issues, and there's a whole bunch of things that just the different applications do have to kind of deal with differently. But there's also an extent to which having good relationships with existing legal systems is kind of a public good across the ecosystem, because unfortunately, if every single project that does kind of lead to one of these kind of splats where people lose a lot of money, like even if that's entirely their fault, it still reflects badly on the entire blockchain ecosystem. And so there are things that we can just do as together to reduce the chance of those kinds of things happening more broadly. So it's kind of there's both application-specific challenges and also things that we can all do to address all of those different challenges.
So blockchain and decentralized protocols, more generally, are incredibly powerful technology that will enable and drive the re-architecting of economic, social, financial, political systems on the planet over the next decades. That is an exciting proposition and a terrifying proposition to many people who run companies, work at companies, are part of governments, are regulators, who are charged with keeping all that working properly. So we've been engaged in so many conversations with politicians and regulators and business leaders around the world in how their contexts can make use of this technology, and different nation states have different philosophies, different systems, and so they'll probably adopt the technology differently. This technology can be embedded in legal systems. There's this notion of Ricardian contracts where you have a document representing a legal agreement that points to a smart contract. Smart contract points to that document, and so you've sort of embedded this new architecture into the old legal architecture. The old legal architecture has to change too to enable some new ways of doing things, and so many conversations have been had and will need to be had over quite a long time. I just spent the last 2 days in Paris at the OECD as a member of the Blockchain Policy Experts Board, and that was about writing a document that all the OECD people and countries can use to sort of guide their thinking and drive new thinking, but also it's a set of principles that you push out into the world and just cause lots of discussions to happen. So it's not prescriptive, it's just these are all of the things that are going on, and this is what's happening, and this is what you should pay attention to. I think Germany now has a national blockchain policy, Australia the same, and so this is all happening, and it's about driving so many discussions about how nation states, companies, etc., want to transform themselves to make good use of the technology. Many are already, many will, others that won't. Darwin has stuff to say about them.
So my question is about funding innovation. And in the past few years, we had crowdfunding mechanisms like...
You said funding invention or
innovation?
Innovation.
that we had crowdfunding over the last few years, including the way Ethereum was funded and the way some of the ICOs happened. Obviously, there were a lot of flaws and bad ones too. But now that regulators have cooled the ICO market and the crowdfunding in general, and have principles against people putting in money into something where they have an expectation of a return, that's possibly going to cool innovation. We've had this massive last few years of lots of excitement and protocol development and application development and maker and status and so on. And will we have that again in the future when the regulators have cooled the crowdfunding mechanisms?
So will we have new funding innovation? Is that roughly?
Well, we got the benefit of a lot of crowdfunding of innovation in the last few years, including Ethereum itself. With those mechanisms now curtailed, what's going to happen in the next few years?
So I don't know that those mechanisms are curtailed. The world funds so many projects using legacy funding mechanisms, and it's just a question of bringing new technology and novel ways of funding projects into prominence. And so tokenized securities haven't really caught on in any interesting way. It doesn't mean they won't. I mean, it really is a better technology with which to issue equities, to do portfolio life cycle management, et cetera. We need to mature that technology. We actually have, we just bought a broker-dealer that will enable us to issue securities, municipal bonds in the United States. And that's an ecosystem that is massive, but sort of captured by major financial organizations. It should be about raising money inexpensively for local projects. It should be about the people benefiting financially, potentially, by putting money into those projects, local people benefiting and having more control over that whole process. It just costs a tremendous amount to raise $5 million for a local pool or something like that. And so by bringing this much more efficient technology into the situation and enabling the local people to have control over that process rather than some major financial institution, I think it's a really big market, and I think there will be impact there. And I think we're just going to see this technology sweep through the entire financial system over the next 5 years, 10 years.
And I think in 2017 definitely was a bit of a kind of temporary dream time for many kinds of coin funding, because ultimately, even if regulators had not shut it down, what would have happened is that people would have realized that these projects are kind of raising money on the back of kind of possible revenue that's where the hopes are much greater than the amount of revenue that's actually possible from many of these projects. And you can't kind of just keep on creating new assets forever. And so I think regardless of what happens, we'd be in the situation where we are today, which is basically just realizing that there's a lot of different kinds of valuable things in the ecosystem, and some of them can be potentially funded on the back of future revenues of different kinds. Other things can't, and for those things, that's basically why things like Gitcoin grants, quadratic funding, and other kinds of decentralized and other kinds of grant making mechanisms exist. And it's definitely the sort of thing that I think the ecosystem will continue to iterate on over time.
Yeah, so our ecosystem's moment of irrational exuberance wasn't the first one in history, all the way back to tulips and probably way before that. And so the internet had its own moment, and there was a tremendous amount of creative destruction that happened after that. All those projects that failed after the initial excitement, which was based on some pretty exciting ideas and visionaries who saw what could be and what inevitably will be. Lots of those projects died. There was lots of learning. Those people moved to another project. Some of those died. There was lots of learning, and it's 2020, and we all live on the internet.
With that, Joe, Vitalik, thank you so much for being on stage.
Thank you.
Thank you.